Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Poland rushes troops to border with Belarus. So Poland on Tuesday said that it was rushing more troops to its border with Belarus after accusing Belarus of violating Polish airspace with military helicopters, a claim that Belarusian officials denied. So according to Reuters, Poland's defense ministry said that it was sending additional forces and resources, including combat helicopters, to the border. Belarus has accused Poland of making up the allegation about helicopters violating its airspace to justify a further military buildup on the border. The Belarusian Defense Ministry said, quote, "This statement was not backed up by data from Poland. The Belarusian Defense Ministry views it in the manner of an old wives' tale and notes there were no border violations by Mi-8 and Mi-24 helicopters," end quote. So Poland has already been beefing up its border with Belarus due to the presence of the Russian mercenary force Wagner Group in Belarus. Wagner members recently held drills near the border, and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko claimed that the Russian mercenaries wanted to enter Poland. Amid these tensions that have been brewing between Poland and Belarus, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned Poland that he would treat an attack on Belarus as an attack on Russia. He also accused Poland of having designs on Ukrainian territory and warned that a Polish-Lithuanian force might enter western Ukraine under the guise of kind of helping, the Ukrainians, but really with the goal of wanting to occupy the territory. That's what Putin's saying. So definitely an area to keep an eye on. Poland has been one of the most hawkish, gung-ho, NATO countries when it comes to supporting this proxy war and their rhetoric and support for Ukraine. And, this is something that could always spiral out of control, especially if helicopters are crossing the border. Who knows what the story is with that. But there are frequently encounters between NATO and Russian, planes in this part of the world, in the Baltics and stuff. So definitely something to keep our eyes on. All right, the next one here, U.S. citizen who was arrested in Ukraine attempts to flee to Hungary. So this is about Gonzalo Lira, who's an American citizen who was arrested in Ukraine back in May. He said on social media on Monday night that he was released on bail and was attempting to cross into Hungary to seek political asylum. So if you don't know about Lira, he's a popular YouTuber and writer. He was arrested by the Ukrainian Security Services, the SBU, for creating content that was critical of the Ukrainian government and explaining how the Russia-Ukraine war was provoked. He was charged over claims that he justified the Russian invasion, so he was arrested over his speech. And so he was, in prison for a while, and then on Monday night, he wrote on this big Twitter thread. He also put up a video on YouTube, so we know it was actually him, not just somebody using his Twitter account. But he wrote on Twitter, which I guess I have to start calling X now, but he wrote that his trial was scheduled for August 2nd, which is Wednesday, and that he was told he would be found guilty and that his sentence will be 5 to 8 years in a prison labor camp. He wrote on Twitter or X, quote, "If you don't hear from me in the next 12 hours, well, I'm on my way to a labor camp," end quote. So it's been over 24 hours since this tweet, and as of Tuesday night here on the East Coast, I haven't seen any activity from him since writing that tweet. So it's not a good sign. Hopefully, he's dealing with the bureaucracy of entering Hungary, but it has been a while now. And he said that he made this post just as he was getting to the Ukraine-Hungary border checkpoint. So he posted a document that he said was the indictment against him, both in Ukrainian and in English translation. He said, quote, "My indictment explicitly states that all I did was discuss publicly known facts about the war. the epitome of free speech in a democracy, end quote. So he alleged that he was tortured during his time in a Ukrainian prison. He said, quote, "Once inside the CISO prison, I was tortured in 2 of the 4 cells I was in by the other prisoners. Guards never beat prisoners. They outsourced torture to the other prisoners. One prisoner actually apologized to me, telling me he had no choice. He wasn't lying. I understood," end quote. So Lira is also a Chilean citizen. He said that the State Department did not offer much help. He said the embassy called him 3 times and gave him nothing but support. So back in May, the State Department refused to say if it was working to free Lira when asked about the case. And on Tuesday, Gray Zone reporter Liam Cosgrove asked State Department spokesman Matthew Miller again about the case, in light of these social media posts. And he said that he could not comment until the situation was confirmed. But, you see the huge difference between when an American citizen is arrested by, what you consider an adversary nation like Russia, or what is supposed to be an ally like Ukraine. They just want to sweep it under the rug. Or when a country like Israel shoots a Palestinian American journalist and kills her, there's not much of a reaction. But when Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested in Russia, it's all you hear about for a while. But with Lira, we don't hear much. So hopefully, he starts posting again. Hopefully he's going to make it to Hungary. It doesn't sound like his prospects are too good in Ukraine, but go check out the thread. He says a lot of things. He basically says that under his bail, because he's out on bail, he was supposed to have an ankle monitor and not leave the city he was in, but they didn't give him the ankle monitor. So what he was kind of saying was that he was giving that they were kind of nudging him to try to leave the country. Maybe the Ukrainians don't want to deal with him. I don't know, but we'll see, how this all shakes out. All right, the next one here, another Ukrainian drone attack targets Moscow. So another drone attack targeted Moscow early Tuesday morning, the second such incident of the week and the 4th since last Monday, as Ukrainian operations inside Russia are increasing. The Russian Defense Ministry said that it downed 2 drones and a 3rd drone crashed into a Moscow skyscraper after being disabled by electronic warfare capabilities. No casualties were reported in the attack. So Moscow's mayor said that the building was damaged in a previous attack, in another recent attack. So just building damage, no casualties. After the attack, Mikhailo Podolyak, who is an advisor to Zelensky, he wrote on Twitter that the Russian capital city, quote, is rapidly getting used to a full-fledged war, which in turn will soon finally move to the territory of the authors of the war to collect all their debts, end quote. So earlier in the week after the Moscow drone attack on Sunday, Zelensky said that the war is, quote, gradually returning to Russia's territory, to its symbolic centers and military bases, end quote. And a spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force said that the purpose of the drone attacks on Moscow is to impact those who feel the war is distant. The comments break from Ukraine's previously ambiguous policy of not commenting on or denying involvement in attacks inside Russia. Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, said that Russia has intensified strikes on Ukraine in response. And there's been civilians reported killed in some of the Russian bombardments. Moscow has accused the West of assisting Ukraine with the operations inside Russia. The U.S. insists that it does not encourage Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, but also has not condemned the drone attacks, which have been targeting civilian areas. So the drone attacks continue. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Washington is desperately seeking more artillery ammunition for Ukraine. So the U.S. is frantically seeking to provide Kiev with more conventional 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. Ukrainian forces are firing more rounds than the U.S. can produce, way more than they can produce, and American weapon stockpiles have reached red line levels. So a U.S. official told Financial Times that the U.S. has inked deals with South Korea and Bulgaria for 155mm rounds and hopes that Japan will make a similar agreement soon. Recently, American officials have admitted that Washington has sent Ukraine all the rounds that the Pentagon is willing to part with. And that was the excuse President Biden used to send the cluster munitions, which are in the form of 155mm artillery rounds. And cluster bombs kill civilians and kill and maim civilians for decades after a conflict ends. The Financial Times report said that Ukrainian forces are currently using about 8,000 artillery rounds per day. Currently, the U.S. can only produce about 24,000 shells per month. So that math is Ukraine is using what the U.S. can produce in a month in 3 days. And NATO military leaders have chastised the Ukrainian officers for relying too heavy on artillery. Ukrainian leaders complain that Western leaders pushed them into a counteroffensive without having air power, leading to Kiev relying on other tactics. This always calls into question the sustainability of, the U.S. and NATO funding this, fueling this proxy war. All right, so the next one here, Australia's Prime Minister says that he is standing firm on Assange. So Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on Tuesday insisted that his government was taking a firm stand against the U.S. persecution of WikiLeaks founder and Australian citizen Julian Assange. So during a recent visit to Australia, Secretary of State Antony Blinken rejected concerns raised by his Australian counterpart about Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison for exposing U.S. war crimes if extradited to the U.S. Albanese told reporters on Tuesday that the U.S. case against Julian Assange has gone on for too long. He said enough is enough. He said Blinken's public comments about Assange echo what U.S. officials have said privately about the WikiLeaks founder. He said, quote, "We remain very firm in our view and our representations to the American government, and we will continue to do so," end quote. So this is good to see him saying that, but on the other hand, while he's insisting that his government is firm on the issue, the U.S. pursuit of Assange has not impacted U.S.-Australian military ties. So I've been covering the U.S. and Australia during that visit when Blinken was in Australia saying this. They also announced all these new, steps to increase the U.S. military footprint in the country. And Gabriel Shipton, he is Julian Assange's brother. He said last week, quote, "Each day the U.S. administration ignores the Australian public on Julian's freedom. It becomes clearer and clearer Australia's true standing in the alliance," end quote. So Assange is currently being held in London's Belmarsh prison, awaiting the decision of another appeal his legal team filed against the UK decision to extradite him to the US. And he's been indicted under the Espionage Act by the US Justice Department for doing journalism. It's related to documents he published that he received from Chelsea Manning using standard journalistic practices. All right, the next one here, Australian MPs blast Blinken over Julian Assange. So more good things to see from the Australian government. This article is from Consortium News. 3 Australian members of Parliament have dismissed U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's strong statement in support of prosecuting imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange as nonsense. Independent MP Andrew Wilkie told The Guardian's Australian edition that Assange was, quote, "not the villain, and if the U.S. wasn't obsessed with revenge, it would drop the extradition charge as soon as possible. Antony Blinken's allegation that Julian Assange risked very serious harm to U.S. national security is patent nonsense. Mr. Blinken would be well aware of the inquiries in both the U.S. and Australia, which found that the relevant WikiLeaks disclosures did not result in harm to anyone. The only deadly behavior was by U.S. forces exposed by WikiLeaks, like the Apache crew who gunned down Iraqi civilians and Reuters journalists," end quote. And he's referring to the infamous collateral murder video. So it was good to see more opposition to the U.S. persecution of Julian Assange from Australia's parliament. And they also quote Liberal MP Bridget Archer, who's another co-chair of the pro-Assange parliamentary group, and Labour MP Julian Hill. They're also rejecting what Blinken has said. So I want to take this moment to mention our sponsor for today's show, and that is the Expat Money Summit, which will be held from October 2nd to October 6th. If you go to expatmoneysummit.com, you could register, put in your email to get a free ticket. The Expat Money Summit is hosted by Mikkel Thorup, and his work is focused on helping people who want to either move out of the country or get citizenship or residency in another country to have a backup plan. It's a very interesting work that he does, and he's also a listener of this show and a supporter of antiwar.com. And so if this is something you're interested in, which I think it's important, in this day and age, you never know what could happen, especially with all these global tensions. It's good to have a backup plan. And this summit, the things that they will cover is residencies and citizenship, wealth protection and tax planning, investing and diversification, the expat lifestyle, community and network, and lots more. There's over 30 speakers, so it's a pretty serious event. And this is the largest, expat event of its kind. So again, expatmoneysummit.com. It's totally free. You enter your email. There's a link in the YouTube description and in the podcast show notes. So go to use that link. Some of the big speakers that they have include Peter Schiff, Mark Faber, Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Jim Rogers, Marissa Medin, and many more. So please go check that out. Support Mikkel and his work. And so expatmoneysummit.com. All right, back to the news here. So the next one here is a little dicey. Military.com op-ed calls for a military draft. So an op-ed published by Military.com called for the U.S. military to restart the draft amid a recruiting crisis resulting from decades of endless wars in the Middle East and Africa and skyrocketing veteran suicide rates. So this is a guy named Joe Plensler. He's a retired Marine lieutenant colonel. He wrote, quote, "The fastest and most effective way to resolve this recruiting crisis is to change how we recruit," end quote. So he called for something between an all-volunteer force and a fully conscripted force. The U.S. draft was abolished in 1973 after years of conscripted Americans being killed in the Vietnam War. Plensler wrote, quote, "We should have our military recruiters sign up new troops for 11 months out of the year and then have the selective service draft the delta between the military's needs and the total number recruited. This would alleviate the incredible pressure on our recruiters, lower the cost of finding new troops, and significantly reduce the much-decried civilian-military gap by subjecting all of America's youth, rich and poor, to the possibility of military service via the draft," end quote. So just not good to see this idea gaining steam. I haven't really seen something this kind of in support of the draft in a while. And, this comes at a very dangerous time. It comes after President Biden called up 3,000 reservists to make available for the Pentagon to deploy to Europe, which signals that the military is already struggling to maintain its current force posture. And, things could get much worse. Things could get much worse in Europe with Russia. Things could get a lot worse over in Asia with China. If they really want war with China, if they're really preparing for World War III, they're going to need a lot of bodies to put on ships. And, they're probably going to resort to a draft. That's why we have to oppose all these dangerous escalations. This is a big reason why. That would be a nightmare if there was a draft like that again in this country. And I mentioned in this article that poll that I discussed yesterday from Gallup that said confidence in the U.S. military is at its lowest point in more than 2 decades. So I would think if they do try to instate a draft, there might be a big resistance movement against it. I can hope. All right, the next one here, Chinese Defense Ministry slams U.S. military aid for Taiwan. So the Chinese Defense Ministry on Tuesday slammed the U.S. for providing Taiwan with a $345 million weapons package that's being drawn from Pentagon stockpiles, and that is an unprecedented form of support, U.S. support for Taipei since the U.S. and China normalized relations in 1979. So I covered this earlier this week, this arms package, and it's a big deal. So that's why I wanted to cover, more complaints from the Chinese government about this. So this is Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman Colonel Tan Kefi. He said, quote, "The U.S.'s act of providing military aid to China's Taiwan region grossly interferes in China's internal affairs, seriously undermines China's sovereignty and security interests, and gravely threatens peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. China is firmly opposed to this and has lodged stern representations with the U.S." End quote. So according to a Chinese Defense Ministry press release, Tan repeated China's position that Taiwan is a red line that cannot be crossed in China-U.S. relations. So the U.S. is sending the weapons to Taiwan using the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which is the main way they've been arming Ukraine. So again, this is a pretty serious form of support for Taiwan. We don't know exactly what's going to be in this weapons package. The U.S. did not publicly announce it. U.S. officials speaking to AP said that it would include man-portable air defense systems, firearms, missiles, and intelligence and surveillance capabilities. So that can mean a lot of things. Some officials said it might include MQ-9 Reaper drones, but that was before it was announced, so it's not clear if that's in there. So who knows? So Tan called for the U.S. to cut all military ties with Taiwan. He said, quote, "We urge the U.S. side to stop all forms of military collusion with Taiwan and avoid going further down the wrong and dangerous path. The wheel of history rolls on toward China's reunification, and it will not be stopped by any individual or any force," end quote. And I think the important point here is that this issue, again, is just more important to China than it will ever be for the U.S., and they're not going to drop it. That's just the situation. That's the reality. And more U.S. support for Taiwan is probably going to make it more likely. I mean, it will make it more likely that China would resort to some sort of military attack on the island. All right, the next one here, the White House backs a renewal of law enabling spying on Americans. So this article is from Connor Freeman over at the Libertarian Institute. The Biden administration released a report endorsing the renewal of a controversial law which enables U.S. intelligence agencies to spy on foreign nationals and American citizens on Monday. This comes amid a heated debate in Congress regarding how such surveillance powers are weaponized against the American people, as well as a slew of scandals involving these capabilities being wielded by the FBI against protesters and lawmakers. So published by the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and Intelligence Oversight Board, the 42-page report states that a failure of Congress to renew Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act before it expires at the end of the year would constitute one of the worst intelligence failures of our lifetime. So Section 702 authorizes a tool used by U.S. spy agencies to conduct warrantless surveillance on foreign targets and any Americans with whom they may be interacting. This practice has long been criticized by domestic civil liberties groups because in the process also collected are U.S. citizens' electronic communications, including phone calls, text messages, and emails. I speak with a lot of people outside of the country, so, under this law, that means that they could, use this to spy on me. So it's a very serious thing here, and it's not a surprise that the White House wants to renew it. If it's not reauthorized in December, the law will expire, which would be very good. And there has been more opposition to this from Republicans lately because the FBI has kind of been weaponized against some of them. So hopefully, that with some of the Democrats that are still opposed to it, you have a lot of Democrats, I'm sure, that favor extending this, but there are still some that are against it. So hopefully it's enough to stop this because this is a serious abuse of the government's power. All right, so the last one here, U.S. and Taliban officials meet in Qatar. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone, again, at the Libertarian Institute. And this is, as far as I know, this is the first, formal meeting between U.S. and Taliban officials since the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan back in August 2021. They've, I believe, held some kind of, some sort of talks, but this is the first official meeting. So U.S. officials met with Taliban diplomats in Qatar for 2 days of talks. The discussions come as Washington's economic war in Kabul has caused severe suffering for the Afghan people 2 years after the end of the U.S. military occupation. So yeah, the U.S. sanctions are all still in effect, and they seized the central bank funds. A State Department press release said that Special Representative for Afghanistan, Thomas West, and the Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Rina Amiri, and the chief of the mission to Afghanistan, Karen Decker, met with senior Taliban officials on Sunday and Monday. The press release said that U.S. officials chastised the Taliban over their human rights abuses, which is not a surprise. Since returning to power in 2021, the Taliban have imposed bans preventing women from publicly participating in society. And Kyle mentions that Washington's human rights record in Afghanistan is also abysmal. America's 2-decade occupation of Afghanistan was marked by mass killings of civilians, torture, and support for warlords who habitually sexually abused young boys. Remember how they left August 29th, 2021. Biden ordered a drone strike that slaughtered 10 civilians and 7 children, one of the last U.S. military action in Afghanistan. During the talks, American and Taliban officials also discussed the Afghan economy. The Taliban's calling for the U.S. to lift sanctions and unfreeze Afghan central bank funds. I don't know if these talks made any progress in that direction or not. It doesn't seem like it. But interesting that they held this meeting. That is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints, one from Ted Snyder, Talking to Russia, 5 Things You Won't Believe Are Being Said Behind Closed Doors. One from Karen Greenberg, The Forever Wars Forever Legacy. One from Peter Van Buren, Disinformation and Censorship, 1984 to 2023. That's over at The American Conservative. One from Ryan McMacken at the Mises Institute, Desertion is a Non-Crime Made Up by the Government. One from Kelly Vlahos over at Responsible Statecraft. It's the spotlight for today. Americans' trust in military hits malaise-era territory. All right. That's it from me for today. You can always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Tell your friends about this show. Share it around. Tell everybody about antiwar.com. All that really helps us. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.